Well, I'm going to invite Bill Grimes to start off on Japan, and followed by Steve Halliwell. Thank you. Bill.
Well, when we talk about Japan these days, all the conversations seem to be about the Democratic Party's stunning electoral victory, the new government, and the speculation about the implications of various personnel decisions. And certainly this is an epical event in Japanese post-war politics, and certainly we can expect significant domestic policy shifts and changes in policymaking and implementation. But as I was told by the editors, the Strategic Asia series is not just about current events, but rather we are given the task of assessing shifts, this is a quote, in strategic goals and power political trajectories, and by extension the larger balance of power in Asia and globally. Now, whether we do that or not is another question, but I think it's fair to say that despite a certain amount of overheated, sometimes uninformed rhetoric, the Japanese election is not part of the central story. In thinking about national strategies, I think it's always best to start from first principles. We need to begin with the constraints and opportunities facing policymakers before we consider how their values and patterns of political support might affect the trade-offs of actual policy. In other words, what are the choices facing Japan? At the grand strategy level, these choices are highly constrained. Whatever anybody is saying, whoever's in power, the basic elements of Japan's grand strategy remain unchanged. Reliance on the U.S.-Japan alliance to maintain national security, embeddedness in a ruled, governed global economic system characterized by openness to trade and financial flows, and ensuring peaceful access to critical raw materials. In other words, the Yoshida Doctrine lives on. But the specifics are in constant flux, which is what my chapter is really about. So this has been an eventful year for Japan. No industrialized economy was hit as hard by the global economic crisis. And this is ironic, since Japanese financial institutions were singularly unexposed to toxic financial assets and had solid capital bases. Unlike in the United States and Europe, the primary channel of transmission for Japan was not financial. Indeed, Japanese banks and financial institutions are still in pretty good condition. Instead, Japan suffered a severe real economy shock, with exports down 50% in January 2009 compared to a year earlier, and automobile production, as just one extreme example, down over 50% year on year in February. The GDP figures follow from there. Japan's economic performance highlights, in fact, the extent to which it still depends on exports, particularly exports that eventually wind up in the United States for growth. Now, the happy part of the story is that Japan has been an extremely responsible global citizen throughout. Domestically, the Aso government quickly put in place a series of stimulus packages amounting to about 14 trillion yen, while the Bank of Japan supported bank liquidity and sought to stave off renewed deflation through quantitative easing measures. Internationally, Japan stepped in at a crucial moment in the crisis with a $100 billion loan to the IMF, which was not popular domestically, but they did it. And this was followed by additional pledges of support from other states and helped to shore up the credibility of the IMF at that crucial time. Japan also has played a positive, albeit not by any means decisive, role in the G20 process, pushing for proactive stimulus measures and a cooperative process to reconfigure global financial regulatory standards. And along with the rest of the leading economies of the world, Japan has avoided using protectionism to address the pain, the very extreme pain in some cases, of its manufacturing industries. So we shouldn't expect any basic changes from these policies, although on domestic level, there will undoubtedly be some restructuring of priorities, and we'll see this in terms of how the fiscal stimulus plans are changed rather than in the elimination of these things. That doesn't mean that the economic crisis and the establishment of a new government will not have implications for Japan's international economic role, however. Going forward, there are two main stories I'd like to highlight. First, the regional center of gravity. I think everybody's already made this point, but I might as well join them. The regional center of gravity is shifting inexorably toward China. The current crisis did not create this reality, but the combination of rapid Chinese growth with Japanese economic decline has accentuated the impression of a meaningful shift. The key point is not which economy is bigger, however we want to measure this, but rather China is becoming a more important economic partner for regional economies in terms of both actual and expected economic transactions, as well as its ability to function effectively in international forums such as the WTO and G20. Japan's opportunity for regional leadership has not passed, but going forward it will be increasingly contingent on Chinese acquiescence, if not active support. The second point I'd like to make is that the global crisis has also drawn attention to the regional financial initiatives of the ASEAN Plus 3. The most advanced of these initiatives, the Chiang Mai Initiative, which was mentioned by Sanjaya Baru earlier, provides a means by which economies facing currency crises can receive emergency liquidity quickly and in large amounts. And the current economic crisis has accelerated plans to expand and enhance the Chiang Mai Initiative. The ASEAN Plus 3 finance ministers announced a seemingly ambitious program of multilateralization in May of this year. Many observers have read this to mean that Chiang Mai Initiative has been transformed into an Asian monetary fund that is functionally independent of the IMF. This is not accurate, however. Such assessments stem partly from wishful thinking, or in some cases, fearful thinking, as the case may be, and partly from a lack of clarity by the ASEAN Plus 3 themselves about what this new initiative actually entails. In point of fact, Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization continues to include a variety of safeguards and strictly maintains the initiative's link with the IMF, whatever has been said or written on this topic, and this reflects the interests of the main creditor nations of Japan and China. Now, we all know, of course, that the new Hatoyama administration has declared its intention to reorient its foreign policy toward Asia, while, of course, as we've learned, keeping the U.S. alliance as a cornerstone of foreign policy. And economic cooperation will clearly be a central element of that. I've already suggested, and for those of you who want more details on this, I do have a book that came out last year, Currency and Contest in East Asia, on the limitations of financial regionalism. But we also see that Japan has significant difficulties, domestic political difficulties, in terms of advancing an FTA strategy. So the places to look for Japanese leadership will be in finance, investment, and aid. In finance, they will be positive initiatives, but they are not going to be, we're not talking about a decoupling story. Indeed, decoupling of the regional financial structure from architecture from the global system is not going to happen despite the turnover in administrations. But we should expect to see the continuation of Asia-oriented policies such as the recently announced 100 billion yen Asian Infrastructure Support Fund to promote further regional growth and integration. Now, before I close, I think it would be odd to make a strategic Asia presentation on Japan this year without at least briefly addressing the effects of the DPJ electoral victory on economic policy and on the U.S.-Japan alliance. With regard to economic policy, the new administration has advocated a variety of principles and concrete policy proposals, some of which have been pretty well publicized here in the United States. Much has been made, for example, of Mr. Hatoyama's criticism of, quote, excessive market fundamentalism, unquote. Let's be clear about this. This is not meaningful as a data point. Not only is it at least largely electoral rhetoric, but it was electoral rhetoric that everybody engaged in. Prime Minister Aso himself complained about excessive market fundamentalism in his newsletters and in speeches. At its core, this is simply a restatement of a long lineage of Japanese economic thought, as well as a recognition of the Japanese people's reasonable anxiety about the weakness of the economy. If we are to predict the Hatoyama administration's actual economic policy preferences and agenda, I think we're better off not looking at these sort of large-scale statements of principles, but rather on the basis of actual pledges, which include preeminently, and I think this is not going to be very impressive to those of you who are thinking in terms of the regional and global implications, highway toll reductions, child allowances, reduced fees for high school, and postponement of any increase in the consumption tax for 4 years. Now, I'm betting that those will be the budget items that go through this year, although the postponement of the consumption tax hike, which is a separate issue, may well end up being shorter than the 4 years given. Any other major budgetary or economic initiatives will have to wait until next summer's upper house election. The policies I've noted obviously have their pros and cons, but they are irrelevant to Japan's international posture. They're even mostly irrelevant to the question of fiscal stimulus, since the way they'll be paid for in fiscal year 2010 will be by shifting existing stimulus funds away from public works. If we are to be concerned about Japanese economic policies in terms of their effect on U.S. interests in the region, I would suggest that the bigger problem is that the new minister in charge of financial regulation and postal reform is Shizuka Kame. Kame is a wily politician and a tough negotiator, but his ideas on economic policies are old-school LDP. And by old school, I mean pre-1980. With luck, his ability to push financial regulation back toward the days of administrative guidance and non-transparency will be limited by a lack of support from above and below, but I think we do need to keep a close eye on finance. Finally, with regard to the alliance, even though we are not entering a new era of division, we are probably re-entering an old era of alliance friction. The internal dynamics of the Democratic Party have dictated that issues like SOFA and Okinawan base restructuring be put on the U.S. agenda, U.S.-Japan agenda once again, and that the Afghan refueling mission end on schedule. Moreover, one of the places that the DPJ will undoubtedly be looking for budget cuts will be defense spending, which has in any event been mostly stagnant for the last decade. It will be important for the U.S. government in this point to pick its battles carefully. How important is the Afghan refueling operation really? That's a rhetorical question with an obvious answer of no, I think. Are there symbolic or even substantive areas where SOFA can be revised without harm to U.S. interests? And let's remember that the DPJ's internal bargain was to reopen discussions about SOFA and Okinawa rather than to enact any specific changes. So these are likely to be protracted discussions, whatever has been said about 100 days. And let's remember also that in the end, the solution to the Okinawa issue has always been more about domestic Japanese politics than about U.S.-Japan negotiations. But I will finish by noting that clearly attention to the domestic Japanese politics of alliance management will be central to dealing effectively with the new administration and the new situation in Japan. Thank you.